This weekend, as it's a national holiday where we stop to remember our freedoms, remember those who defend our freedoms, the weekend just has a bit of a patriotic lean to it. And I thought it would be an apropos time to launch into a sermon that was very, very political. Now, the first question would be, why in the world would I want to do that? Because I like working here. But the reality is there's kind of two sides to this equation. When I say stuff like that, immediately some of you are already clinched up. You're already tense because we understand that the conversation about religion and the conversation about politics should never intersect, and there's this separation of church and state that we're always talking about. We don't really know what it means, but we know it means you're not supposed to talk about politics in church, and we have all those things, and so this conversation should not happen. And then there's the rest of you. Well, let's face it, if I would get up here and do a couple of stump speeches for you, as long as it was for the right candidate, you wouldn't mind. All right? You think that maybe these conversations should be a little bit more connected than they are. But rest assured, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I'm not going to tell you what political party you should belong to. What we're going to talk about today is how to be a Christian. How to be a Christian, how to live as a Christian should live in an environment that is oftentimes so divisive, an environment that is so contentious, and an environment that we've somehow lost the ability to have conversations in. And oftentimes we'll take kind of a passage of Scripture, a book of the Bible, or a chapter of the Bible, and we kind of chew it up and verse by verse, and we go down and we look at the application of that. And we're not going to do that today. I'm going to look at a couple of verses specifically. But today we're going to talk about what the entirety of Scripture says about certain topics. That's right. Today I'm going to preach the entire Bible, so I hope that you packed a lunch. Many of you had the opportunity this past week on Tuesday to participate in what many people called the most important election ever. All right, this past Tuesday, if you listen to the talking heads, if you listen to the candidates, this past Tuesday was the most important election ever. And if that sounds familiar, as if, where have I heard that before? Well, we have a couple of pictures here. Bill Clinton said it in 2000 for the race that followed him, and Barack Obama said it in 2008, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. Some of those elections of which he wasn't even involved in, that was the most important election ever. In fact, if you go back a little bit further in history, Newt Gingrich said it in 1996. Richard Nixon said it about the 1968 election, that this is the most important election ever. And it took a lot of digging, but I did actually find a tweet from George Washington that said, "I cannot tell a lie. This is the most important election in the history of America. Hashtag new country, hashtag I am your father." So it seems like every single election is that this is the one, this is the most important election, this is the one that's going to affect your children, this is the one that's going to affect your grandchildren, this is the one that's either going to destroy or revive the economy, the environment, your rights, my rights. This is the most important election. And there are ideas that are common to every election cycle. Some of these ideas include the fact that we don't have all the facts, but we have all the answers. You know that to be true, right? You don't have all the facts, but you know you have all the answers. How right you are and how wrong they are, or how right you are and how left they are, however you want to look at it. Or the phrase that we use oftentimes during the election cycle, the lesser of two evils, right? You feel like you have to vote and pick the lesser of two evils. Elections are a reminder of what our national conscience looks like. Now, a national conscience works just like your conscience works. Okay, you have a personal conscience. Your family has a conscience. It's kind of influences to how you were raised up, what region you grow up in, where you lived. If you own a business or you run a business, your business kind of has a conscience of how it chooses to operate. And the national conscience works like that as well. I'll give you an example of how conscience works because it's very powerful. Most of you, hopefully all of you, if you had a bag of fast food trash in the bottom of your car, your favorite fast food place. Now, obviously, if it's Chick-fil-A, you can eat all that. You can eat the bag, you can eat the paper. It's all good. All right? But at Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, you got a bag of trash. Many of you, most of you, hopefully all of you, would not take that trash and chunk it out the window of your car as you drove down Mountain Road. Now, why would you not do that? Because it's illegal? You guys break the law all the time. All right, most of you broke the law driving to church today because the suggested speed just is not what you want to drive. It's not because it's against the law. Your conscience, something within you says, that's just not right. It has nothing to do with laws. There's just something within us that says that's just not right. In fact, our laws as a nation have been influenced by our conscience over time. Our national conscience has evolved over time. When we look back in our history, and even in our short nation's history, we have some stains on our history. We have things like slavery, which was legal. And ultimately, people finally looked at it and said, it doesn't matter what the law says, that's just not right. We had civil rights issues that came up that said it was in fact legal to oppress people of certain backgrounds, certain skin colors. And people finally stood up and said, you know what? That's just not right. It doesn't matter what the law says. And all throughout our nation's history, things have come and gone like prohibition and different drugs that we are okay with, aren't okay with, more comfortable with, less comfortable with. And the conscience shifts as people shift. But the conscience, the national conscience, is always kind of caught in this tension, and it's the tension of ought to versus ought not, right? We just understand that you just ought to do certain stuff, and you ought not do other stuff. And that doesn't have anything to do with the laws. That is just how our conscience works. It's how yours works individually. It's how our national conscience would work, something you just ought to do. And when you have an agreement that's built on these principles, you actually don't need a lot of laws. You don't need a lot of laws because you just do what you ought to do and you don't do what you ought not do, and life just works out just fine. If you're married, you understand this. Because you did not sit down with your spouse before or after you're married and say, okay, here are the rules. Okay? Don't cheat on me. You've got 2 times tops to cheat on me, and then we're done. You know, this is how much money that you're allowed to spend. And you can only exceed this amount of money 2-3 times, and then we're done. You didn't establish rules for your relationship. You didn't put them down on paper. You just went into a marriage with an understanding, okay, this is what we should do. There are certain things we should do. There are certain things we shouldn't do. And that's how healthy marriages work. But the problem is when the conscience erodes, when your conscience starts to erode, conscience is just like a guitar player. Their fingers, they get calluses on them over time. They work up calluses. Your conscience can work up a callus as well. And when your conscience erodes, something else dictates your ought to and your ought not. All right? And when the national conscience erodes, as it has from our inception, something else dictates our ought tos and our ought nots. Your ought tos and your ought nots will be dictated by laws. It'll be dictated by courts. It'll be dictated by politics. We have, each and every one of us has an informed conscience. It might be informed by your faith, hopefully. It might be informed by the way you grew up. It might be informed by different factors in your life and experience and reason. But everyone has an informed conscience. The Apostle Paul spoke about this a little bit. In the book of Romans, just a couple verses we're going to look at. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law." So Gentiles is kind of blanket umbrella that all unbelievers fit under. You know, they didn't get the law. The law was for the Jewish people. The law was for God's people. And he's saying Gentiles don't have the law, but sometimes they do what they're supposed to do. You know, sometimes they just do what they ought to do because it's part of their conscience. And verse 15 says, "They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." It's like, look, sometimes they do the right thing just because it's the right thing. Gentiles don't kill people all the time, right? But the law says not to kill, and they don't have the law, but they still don't do that much, or at all, because it's written on their hearts. And the purpose of their conscience and the purpose of your conscience is to kind of referee this battle that we have of accuse versus excuse. Your conscience accuses you and says, hey, you shouldn't do that. Or your conscience excuses you and says, that's okay. And that's the battle that you live in. So then, if that's how conscience works, that's how yours works individually, that's how it works in your family, how then was our national conscience formed? Well, I won't manipulate history as some people do, and I won't stand up here and tell you that all of our founding fathers were Christians. That is not accurate. And very few of them were Baptist at all. I know, I'm sorry. Many of them were Christians. Many of them were just deists. They believed in a God. They believed in an intelligent designer. But one thing that our country was founded on, one thing that started to form the national conscience from the very beginning, was a sense of a corporate and an individual accountability to God. That we were personally and ultimately, nationally, responsible to God. That formed our national conscience. That's what we were built on. It's reflected in documents like the Declaration of Independence. Many of you memorized that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence in school. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. You're not endowed by government, you're not endowed by law, you're not endowed by who you are, but just God says that you have these rights. And so from the beginning, we're going to have a country built on this ought to, that folks just ought to have these rights bestowed on them. And even we didn't get that right because this was leveraged in dark times in our country's history where we had to look at this and we say, you know what? This isn't actually true for everyone. This isn't actually true for other races. We need to fix that. This isn't actually true for women. We need to fix that. And so even our very conscience had to be honed and had to be dialed in because we realized that it wasn't true for everybody. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address. And he said this over the fall, and he said, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom." This is actually the first high-profile use of this phrase, under God. And Lincoln leveraged that, even acknowledging, hey, we're not getting it right. We're in the middle of a civil war. But there was this understanding that we were a nation under God's sovereignty, a nation whose conscience was formed by the fact that there was a God and there was a Creator over all. In the 1950s, that language was actually added to our Pledge of Allegiance. So when we pledge allegiance to the flag, we are acknowledging that we are a nation under God. We are a nation under God even though we are a nation that doesn't agree on God. That we are a nation under God. That formed our national conscience. And then in 1956, the national motto became, "In God we trust." Now, to me, this is fascinating. This is our national motto. This is our Radio Shack. You've got questions. We've got answers. This is America. In God we trust. That's our motto as a country. And you want to talk about an act of Congress to get something done? It actually took an act of Congress. It was the 84th Congress that said, this is the motto of the United States of America. Not in a puritanical society or hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, but within some of your lifetimes, they said, this country, in God, we trust. Don't you find that fascinating? Don't you look out in 2018 and say, really? One, how did Congress agree on anything? And two, they said that that's okay? That that's our national motto? Can you imagine if in school on Tuesday, the principal got on the intercom and he said, welcome to school, and here are the announcements, and lunch today is rectangular pizza and a carton of milk. And by the way, kids, remember, national motto, today at school, trust God. Can you imagine? There would be so many lawsuits. People would lose their minds because they said the national motto. It's a Congress national motto. Because the reality is, when it comes to our national conscience, we have drifted greatly from this principle. And so what we do every couple years, usually on Tuesdays and usually in November, is we try to answer the age-old question. Whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that we've drifted so far from our national conscience of being a nation under God, trusting God? Because we're a country with issues. And we've got problems, many of which seem like insurmountable, and they're complex problems, and we can't answer them. Like, what are we supposed to do, right? We're the good guys. We're the Christians. We're supposed to do something about that. Many of our problems end up being financial problems just by virtue of we're such a big nation with a lot of resources. And while we have financial problems, it's important to remember we do not have a lack of prosperity. We're one of the most prosperous countries in the world. We have an abuse of prosperity, but we don't have a lack of prosperity. And we kind of talk about the financial makeup of the country, and I'm going somewhere with this, but the United States is $21 trillion in debt right now. It's no big deal. It's fine. We have an excellent interest rate. We are $21 trillion in debt, and it's hard to look at national debt over the years because it has to be adjusted for inflation, and so the numbers get kind of weird. But we often look at our national debt as a percentage of our gross domestic product, the percentage of our debt versus the percentage of what we're making. And our debt right now is not as high as it's ever been, believe it or not. The highest national debt as a percentage of GDP was back in the mid-40s, right after the war. But we are a nation in debt. Of all things, we're in debt. And for those of you who are in debt, you know how awful that is, right? We are a nation in debt. And for those of you who want to go back to the good old days before we were in debt, that doesn't exist. The United States has always been a nation in debt. In fact, we have one calendar year where we were not in debt. Does anyone remember when it was? Many of you might remember it. It was 1835. Some folks of the other service remembered it. It was 1835. Andrew Jackson paid off the national debt and then took out a loan in 1836. But for a brief period of time, we were out of debt. And, and we all have answers to these questions. And, it's easy to think, man, if I was in charge, if I was in charge of the country or the state, or even if I was in charge of some of our local government, I would never let that happen. So how do we drift so far away from in God we trust? How do we get all these problems mounted so high? Well, I'm going to give you my list of problems. Now, you may not agree with these problems. They're somewhat political in nature. They're somewhat controversial. They may differ from your list. But I'm going to share with you my list of problems because I have the microphone. Problems in America. We have an entitlement problem. Okay, and I'm not talking, before you get really excited, I'm not talking about things that fall under the umbrella of what we call entitlement programs and who should get them and who doesn't and things like that. I'm talking about the concept of entitlement. The concept that you're supposed to have something and you don't have it. And that makes you mad. And so you feel entitled. You feel like there are just certain things you should have. And entitlement is the great equalizer in our country, because do you know what happens to a rich person when you take something away from them that they feel like they're supposed to have? The same thing that happens to a poor person when you take something away from them that they feel like they're supposed to have, which is the same thing that happens to a middle-class person when you take something away from them that they feel like they're supposed to have, which is the same thing that happens to a baby when you take away something that they feel like they're supposed to have. They whine, and they cry, and they say, that's not right. I'm supposed to have that. Because in our country, we just don't have to hear no a lot. We're a prosperous country. And so when we hear no too many times about things that are really important to us, we take opportunity to vote someone in who will say yes more than they'll say no to the things that are important to us. We have an entitlement problem. We have a discipline problem. We have a problem where we know what we're supposed to do financially. We know what we're supposed to do morally. We know what we're supposed to do legally. We just don't do it. We have a discipline problem in sticking to this is what we're supposed to do and this is how we're supposed to operate. We have a greed problem. Greed is simply the understanding that everything that passes through my fingers is for me. That it's my money, I earned it, and so it's mine, and I should be able to do with it what I want, and I should accumulate as much of it as I possibly can, and I don't have to give up any of it if I don't want to. We have a greed problem. We have a failure of nerve problem. A failure of nerve problem works like this. In 2016, approximately 30% of the electorate that voted for the United States president did so not voting for the candidate that they wanted, but voting against the candidate that they did not want. And how that works is, of that 30%, if anybody in that 30% voted for Hillary Clinton, it was not because they wanted her to be president. It's because they didn't want Donald Trump to be president. And within that 30%, anyone that voted for Donald Trump, it was not because they wanted him to be president. It was because they didn't want Hillary to be president. So we have 30% of the people that did not want, they just didn't want the other. what happens is politics is a game to win. You have to play to win. And so there are candidates over here that probably line up with us more politically. They line up with us more morally. They may even line up with us more spiritually. I can't vote for that person. If I vote for that person, I'll be throwing my vote away. My vote won't count. And if I do that, they'll win. And I can't just give them the election, so I have to vote for this undesirable candidate because it's the what? The lesser of two evils. Now that doesn't make sense. And a failure of nerve simply means that you know what the problem is and you know what the solution is. You're just not willing to handle the consequences of making the right decision. And statistically and mathematically and logically, if you would just continue to vote for the people that you really support, that really line up with how you feel morally and politically and socially, ultimately these candidates would start to look more like this because they would recognize that there's support for these kind of candidates. But we won't do that. Because if we would do that, these people might win. And it's more important that they don't win than we actually vote our conscience. You understand what failure of nerve is if you're a parent, because it's why many of you woke up with a toddler or a 5-year-old in your bed this morning. Because the rule is you sleep in your own bed. And I'll put you back in your own bed a couple of times, and I'll have that argument, and I'll deal with it for a while. But eventually, I just got to sleep. Whatever it takes, I just got to sleep. We have a failure of nerve that we won't deal with things, and we won't stick to our principles and stick behind people because we don't want to waste our vote. We don't want to let the other people win. And many of you hear these problems. You hear the entitlement problem, the financial problem, the greed problem, and all these things, and you agree with me. And you agree with me because right now, today, you're sitting there and you are hearing them through the filter of your own political bias. Now, I promise I am going to be an equal opportunity offender this morning. Because you sit there and you're like, you know what? The Republicans are greedy. They do have a greed problem. It seems like every law they enact only helps people with more money than me. It doesn't actually help me. They have a greed problem. And the folks on the other side are saying, you know what? There is an entitlement problem in this country. The Democrats have an entitlement problem. Everything's supposed to be free and I'm supposed to pay for it, and that's not right. So we hear all these problems, and they're filtered through our political bias. And then we as Christians have to figure out the biggest question of all. Which political party does Jesus belong to? Right? And it's like, well, surely Jesus was a Republican because, traditional values, and I'm pretty sure I've seen pictures, his sash was red, and, and it's like, well, but, he had an unwed mother, and so he probably got assistants or something, so maybe he was Democrat, and it's like, how does this work? And we start to pick up our stones, and we say, you have a greed problem. And we pick up these stones and says, you have an entitlement problem, and you're wrong, and you're wrong. And we just look to Jesus and try to figure it out. And here's what he says, Matthew chapter 7, verse 3. Jesus says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? I know. Yes, you with the microphone. Okay, Jesus, we do that because it makes us feel empowered, and it makes us feel right, and then I don't have to do anything differently. Verse 4. Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? Jesus, I don't have a log in my eye. And then Jesus says, and Jesus says this, I would never say this to you. Jesus says in verse 5, you hypocrite. You hypocrite. Okay, now we understand that a hypocrite is oftentimes, don't be critical of others because you have issues and everybody's got issues, and don't be critical. But it's so much more than that. Because the definition of a hypocrite is someone who expects something of someone that they won't do themselves. That's what a hypocrite is. Or a hypocrite is someone that holds others to a standard different from the standard they hold themselves to. And Jesus says, you hypocrite. You're holding people to a standard, and you've got a log in your eye. They've got a speck, you've got a log. They've got a speck, you've got a log. He says, first, take the log out of your own eye. Now, sequence is important. Sometimes we're given things to do in Scripture, and we're giving them a certain order, and sequence is important. He says, first, take the log out of your eye. That means first, Democrats, look in the mirror. Republicans, look in the mirror. Christians, look in the mirror. And then, like all good commands, there's a promise that comes with it. He says, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. And many of you, all you hear is you get to the end of that verse and you say, aha, I knew it, he does have a speck in his eye. The point is, when you address your issues, that's when you can be effective. And when your shortcomings aren't addressed, you can't see clearly enough to help. So I told you this, we're going to look at the entirety of Scripture. What does the Bible say about what we're supposed to do? And if you're here today and you're not a Christian, you get to pick and choose. What do these sound good and which ones don't? But as Christians, we're actually given very specific commandments of how we're supposed to operate. And this is challenging. And this is hard. But the reality is, when we look at the political landscape and we look at how we're supposed to operate within our government, within the political landscape, what if it's a we problem, not a they problem? What if there are things that we should be doing differently, and it actually has nothing to do with they? I'll give you a few examples, and these are hard, and they're hard, I'm sorry. Evangelical Christianity. If you didn't know it when you walked in the door this morning, you're a part of evangelical Christianity. That's what we are under the umbrella of. Evangelical Christianity is generally always going to vote for candidates and for legislation that supports what we would call traditional family values. That means things like the traditional definition of marriage, things that concern gender identity and things of that nature, because we believe that the Bible, that homosexual lifestyle and the sins involved with homosexuality are incompatible with human teaching. That's just not right, as we used before, and that's true. It's always been true. It's in the Bible. It's always true. So we generally vote to not legalize things that we feel to be contrary to that. That's what evangelical Christianity is known for, and that's just the fact. That's not an opinion. That's just the way that evangelical Christianity votes. Why then is the divorce rate among Christians so comparable to non-Christians? Because it's really hard to leverage a conversation against people who they're destroying the family, right? That's always the argument against the legalities or the illegalities of who can marry who, is we can't destroy the fabric of the family. It's like, you know what? We're doing that really well on our own. And that maybe instead of fighting against the legalities of who can do what, we should just model what Christian relationships are supposed to look like. That we are supposed to model what Christian families are supposed to look like. And yeah, if you can vote your morality and vote your conscience, and that's important, support the things that you support. But the most important thing you do as a Christian is to actually act like a Christian in your relationships, in your families, in your marriages. We have a wonderful benefit as Americans. We pay our taxes, and then you get to decide, either through voting for people or voting for legislation, you get to kind of decide how your money is spent, unless you live in D.C. But that's on them. We get to decide, and taxation without representation, that was a big thing that we were against. And so we get to decide how our money's spent, who we help, how we help, and that's your American right. But did you know, as a Christian, the only argument you should be having when it comes to helping people, when it comes to assisting people, when it comes to benevolence, the only argument you should be having is how we can help, not if we can help. Now, the how we can help argument is big enough to occupy you for a few days, so you can stick on that argument for a while, but it should never be an argument as to if we're going to help, because we just do, because that's just what Christians do. That we are called to help people regardless of their race, their creed, their national origin, their citizenship. We're called to help people when it inconveniences us. We're called to help people even without sometimes regard for our personal safety. Like, we are just called to help people. And you can talk and we can discuss as good Christians, how's the best way to do that? What should we do that? But the argument should always be how, not if. That's just what Christians do. And there's so many ways that you can misquote me in this sermon today. So don't go home, oh, good Lord, Pastor John's for open borders. That's not what I said. Okay, because that's what some of you are thinking. You're twitching already. All I'm saying is, there are things that you will be commanded to do as a Christian. There will be things that you will be motivated to do as a Christian, things you are supposed to do as a Christian that just simply do not fit neatly into your little political box. That everything about your faith does not line up with your political party, no matter which political party you support. We talk about things like religious freedom, and we have to vote to defend our religious freedom, and I believe that. I want to do this with you guys every Sunday till Jesus comes back. But do you know religious freedom is not the most important thing? That actually, all throughout history, Christianity has thrived and even grown to the likes of which we can't even understand when Christianity was illegal. When Christianity wasn't allowed to be is when it beed the most it could be. And there are places right now in the world, places you've never heard of, where Christianity is illegal, that they are exploding with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And while I am grateful for religious freedom, and I am so grateful for the people that make sure we have that and defend that it's actually not the most important thing. But the most important thing is that we act like Christians. We talk about things like prayer in schools. And in the 60s, they made a law, now we can't pray in schools. That's never been the law, okay? You may have misread the law. Okay, they said that, and it depends on the state, but different leadership, teachers can't lead prayers, principals can't lead prayers, they can't pray. Okay, that's fine. Do you know you can still pray so hard in school? Do you know that if you're a teacher, you can meet with other Christian teachers, you can just get together and say, maybe we should pray about this day, maybe we should ordain this day, because we have a really hard job. And do you know if you're a student and you go to school, you can just kind of hang out with your friends, and whether it's at the lunch table or at the locker room, you can say, hey, we should pray. You guys have anything you want to pray about? That you can do that? That's perfectly legal? But we're so busy championing for, we got to be, it has to be legal for us to do whatever we want. It's like, you can pray. You can always pray. There are enough Christians in the country that if everybody else just did whatever they were going to do, like if we just acted like Christians, it's so changing to the fabric of our nation. More we questions that we have to answer. Are you disciplined with your money? So I'm just going to equally offend everyone and get all up in your business today. Do you give? Do you save? And are you not stuck in a vicious cycle of consumer debt? Okay, if you do that, you are the exception to the rule. Because most people do not give enough, do not save enough, are stuck in a round of debt, and then you kind of lose your leverage or lose your ability to have conversations about, why is the government in debt? Because you are. Like, you're not, they're just doing what you do. Uncle Sam is just following your lead. So what if just Christians, nobody else, what if just Christians decided that we're going to be financially responsible? That we are going to give, that we are going to save, that we are not going to be under the burden of debt, and that's how we're going to live our life. Do you know how much money we would have just to do ministry? Are you greedy? Does 98% of what comes your way get spent on you? The average American gives away 1.8% of their wealth. But we were never called to be average Americans. We were called to be Christians. What if just Christians live their lives differently? What if just Christians gave? We don't talk a lot about money here because as a church we are blessed. You guys give and we do ministry and it's fantastic. But just a couple numbers to throw your way. And this is not to guilt anybody into giving. This is the reality of where we are. This is a mathematical reality. All right? This church is on pace. We will receive in contributions this year about $600,000. And that allows us to have heat and lights. That allows your pastors to have a livable wage. That allows us to do ministry. That allows us to support smaller churches that don't have those kind of resources. That allows us to buy goldfish crackers for your kids that are back there in Sunday school. There's so many things we do because this church gives the way it gives, and we are so blessed. But here's the mathematical reality with the number of people that attend this church. If everyone was a baseline biblical tither, and if everyone made marginally above the poverty level, and we know that many of you, if not most of you, make much more, because we are a blessed people. If everyone that attended this church was a biblical tither, and if no one made more than right above the poverty level, we should take in about $1 million a year in contributions. That's just the mathematical reality of A plus B equals C. Now, all that means is we don't give like we should. All right? And what could this church or any church do with an extra $400,000? What other kind of ministry could we do? How many more people could we help? So when you expand that out to other churches just like ours, where people aren't giving like they should give, can you imagine how many people we could help in the ministry we could do if just Christians, not Democrats or Republicans or the people down the road or the other religion, if just Christians decided this is how we're going to live our life? Do you have a failure of nerve problem? Do you have problems where it's like, I know what I should do, but I don't want to do it because if I do that, the other people might win, and I just can't stand the idea of that happening? Here's the challenge, and then I'm done, and we can be friends next week. My challenge to you is to not view your faith through the filter of your politics, but to always view your politics through the filter of your faith. That's it. And it's not neat, and it's not easy, and it should challenge you where you stand politically right now. It should challenge you. And if we expand this thought, always view your politics, your relationships, your priorities, your finances, your social media posts, your conversations, your decisions through the filter of your faith. What if we did all of that? What if we just viewed everything through the filter of what Jesus called us to do? And while we're on it, this is free. Can we remove a few words from our language? Okay? You're familiar with libtard, right? That's a derogatory term toward people that have a liberal philosophy on politics. I don't know I'm sure there is a conservative version, I just don't know what it is. But this is not even a spiritual thing, this is just a life. When did it become okay to call people names? You learn, the first 3 things you learn, how to tie your shoes, don't pick your nose in public, don't call people names. This is just, and you would never act like that. You would never act like that in any other avenue of your life, but you disagree with somebody politically and all of a sudden it's okay to call them really offensive names. What if just the Christians got this right? Nobody else. What if just the Christians started acting like the Christians were supposed to act? It would change the world. It sounds like an oversimplification of the message. Okay, we're supposed to love God and we're supposed to love people. And is it really that simple? Yes. But just because it's simple does not mean that it's easy. It's challenging. But here's what I know to be true. Solutions don't begin in Washington. Solutions begin in places like this. Solutions begin in your home. Solutions begin when you make decisions as a family as to how you're going to live. Because it is far more important what you do in your house than what happens in the White House. And it is far more important what you do in your house than what happens in the State House. Our behavior needs to change more drastically than our legislation. That's a reality. And be involved. Okay, vote. Okay, be involved, vote, be a part of the process. Some of you run, for goodness sake. I mean, I've read your Facebook posts. You have all the answers. Run. I'll vote for you. Okay, be involved in the process. But if our behavior as Christians changed, we're not calling anybody else out, just the Christians. If our behavior changed, it wouldn't matter what the law was or what the legislation said. The national conscience would be moved. The national conscience would change. And it was a conscience that at one point was built upon a simple understanding that above all things, in God we trust.